All right, welcome back to Web 110 HTML and CSS. For this video, I'm going to be talking about working with images in a variety of different ways. And I really recommend that you are following along with these demonstrations and actually typing things out yourself. But if you are, you need to download the images that are going to be used for these examples. So under week 3, you'll notice that I have the directions here: download animal folder under files, and then download week 6 folder under files. So if you go to the navigation on the left side, you'll see that there's files here, and I've got a lot of stuff in here. It's just the various pages and stuff that are linked, but you're going to look at animals. And if you go to the right side and if you hover over whichever item, you'll notice that there is going to be this drop-down navigation button. So there's the 3 dots over top of each other. If you click on that, it gives you the option to download the whole thing. This is going to be really handy. Otherwise, if you go into the folder, it's going to prompt you to download them all separately. So if you go to the right where there's that 3 dots over top of each other, you can click download. So the animal folder was the first one, and then I also have a week 6 folder, which is where this would have fallen in line if this was a full-length semester class, and I'm just gonna have you download that too. And the nice thing about this is you can just skip ahead or pause while you let all of that download. Get rid of all of these. And while this is downloading for me, I'm going to have us take a look at some of the other links that I have on here. So if you go to week 3, I've got the WebSafe color chart, Zen Garden, CSS Validator, and then I've got that point to pixel converter. Now, the rest of these are going to have to do with your images. Let me just move that. So I've got 10 must-know image optimization tips. There's a link to HTML map tag. We're going to look at that later. And then I've got some files that are specific to looking at favorites icons. So I'm going to start here with this link. And actually, before I go into too much detail on working with optimizing your images, I do want to talk a little bit about different file formats and different file types. Your book is going to go into detail. I want to add a little bit more information. And actually, this page itself has a little bit of information. Let me see if I can scroll so we can get a little bit of more visuals. Might be a slightly different list. So towards the very bottom, it talks about choose the right image format, and says there are 3 common file types that are used to post images to the web: JPEG, GIF, and PNG. And those are the exact same ones that I wanted to talk about as well. So this says this image is a JPEG. So, and you'll see JPEG written JPEG, JPG, both are fine. It says here, JPEG is the de facto standard image file type for the web. JPEG images can be compressed considerably, which is why they're so popular, which results in quality images with a small file size. The image above the JPEG format allows decent quality at a low size. All right, so this is one of my favorite images. If you go to Google Images and you just type in PNG versus JPEG, I feel like this helps to illustrate how JPEGs are different than PNGs and other file types. And there's actually some other things here, like this shows the top 4 image formats for the web. Well, you'll notice that there's SVG that also wasn't on the list. This is actually a really great list reference. So there's some of these terms like raster versus vector. So maybe we could start there. So raster is going to be images that have pixels, and if you resize it to make it larger, those pixels start looking really blocky, And if it's smaller, you start having less of that information. So when a JPEG is compressing the information, it's kind of looking at all those pixels and it's simplifying it down. And so when you go and you have a picture that you take with a digital camera, it's going to be some sort of proprietary file type, and proprietary meaning that it is specific to the software or hardware that you're using. Each camera is going to kind of save it as its own file type, and then as you're moving those files over to your computer, it's going to ask you if you want to change it into a different file type. If you're into photography, you might be more familiar with other file types like TIFF files, TIFF, and those would compress your files a little bit less than JPEG files. And so you do need to compress your files to work with them a lot of the time, but then by compressing it, you do lose some information and some detail. So it's a lot about how you are importing your images, how you're saving them, how you're sharing them. A good way to think about this would be, you may have noticed that when images get shared online, when they get shared over and over and over again, and someone downloads the same image that someone else has uploaded, and then they do that over and over again, is kind of slowly degrading the image where you can barely even see the detail in it anymore. And so that's going to be compressing it, and it's going to be losing that detail. So usually what my recommendation is, when you are working with files and you want to work with your files in a way that's not going to lose all this detail, is try to have master copies of all of your images. And that's, you will go back to those files time and again and work with those directly, and then save those in your image editor into the various sizes that you need, rather than taking a file and kind of blowing it up larger or shrinking it down and hoping that it retains the quality of it. And I've done this before, where I've put images on my website, and rather than sorting through all of my various folders on my computer, I'll just download the image from my website instead of actually going and finding the original file. So it's definitely something that is a normal thing for people to want to do, but you really do want to go to that master copy, but you want to keep it. You want to save versions of it and copy it into new folders and not mess with that original file, so that way you don't lose that. So that would be my recommendation for someone who's working with digital media, is copy your files and always keep your master copies of the original images, so that way you can go back to having all of that detail, because once it gets turned into a JPEG, it's going to get compressed and it's going to lose some of its information. So anyways, raster is those pixels, which means vector is going to be different. And vector means, let me see if I can find an image. I'm going to do this in a new tab. So as you can see, I think this is a good example. When you are working with a raster image, you have these different pixels, and when you try to scale it up or down, you're going to become more aware of how this blurs and you lose detail and information. Versus when you are working with a vector, it is turning it more into this mathematical expression where it's able to scale it up and down. If you remember back to working with, I don't know if this would be trig or calc, but where you could draw a line or a slope or something, or a sine wave, that expression for how you would write that out mathematically is always going to be accurate no matter how small or how big it is. And so artists have actually been able to come a really long ways with being able to represent visual information with vectors and have it actually provide a lot of information. It used to be, if you wanted to have a gradient or something, that you really had to do that with a raster image, but nowadays you can actually do quite a lot. And you'll notice here we've got raster versus vector with typography. So a lot of times logos, you will want to use vectors, so that way you can blow it up larger or shrink it down and make it smaller. This is kind of another good image, though it's a little bit smaller, where it's showing a brush stroke. This is kind of a good illustration where it's showing how you can map out these different points versus painting with it. So if you have something, oh, here's that image. So if you have something that is drawn out digitally, you can use various tools like this pen tool, and you can plot out all of these points, and that makes it really easy for it to behave as a vector image and be able to be scalable. Versus if you are working with a photograph, that's always going to be a raster image. If you are painting digitally, that can kind of go back and forth, and illustrators go back on and forth on what they prefer. I know some illustrators really like working more with raster images. Some of them like working a little bit more with vectors. But artists have come a very long ways in being able to create very detailed images just with vectors. I think it's really amazing that they're able to do so much, even with brush work, to be able to draw out how a brush stroke would look, but doing that as a vector instead of having to do that with a raster. And you can see there's a little bit of even gradation that's included in some of these. The artwork does still have a tendency to be rather flat just because of how it has to be created. But there's still quite a lot here, and then you can scale this up or scale it down as much as you want, and you're not going to lose detail. It's going to look really fine. So this is something that you would definitely want to have as much as you can for like graphics, like logos. I was going to say infographics would be another good one that you could do. Any sort of icons or anything would be really great. And then your photography is going to be more rasters. All right, so going back to this, you'll notice that we also have transparency is listed for PNG, SVG. Technically, GIF also has really basic transparency. We've got animation listed here, and then we've got lossy. So that's referring to the fact that JPEGs are very compressed. So what I wanted to mention here, though, with the PNG versus the JPEG is JPEG files are not transparent in the way that some of these other files are. So GIFs can have very basic transparency. PNGs are going to give you kind of the best amount of transparency. And then, of course, there's the, well, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So in mentioning vectors, usually the type of file type that people are most familiar with for working with vectors would be Adobe's Illustrator file type, which is an AI file, but it is specific to being opened up with Adobe Illustrator. And so if someone wanted to create a vector file that didn't have to be opened with Adobe software, then you would want to pick an SVG file. So that's going to be your best option for working with vector graphics. Anyway, sorry. Back to working, though, with our PNG versus JPEG files. So if you have ever tried to collage images or try to, let's say that you're working on a PowerPoint and you wanted to bring an image that you found into your PowerPoint and you didn't like that it looked like it was just this cutout object, like this apple. That's why I like this image. It looks like it should be completely empty around it. And you might have even taken an image into like Photoshop or something, highlighted everything, tried to delete the background from it. But the minute that you save it as a JPEG, it's going to fill in that background with something. It could be white like this if that's the default, or it could be black or something. But it's going to actually it's going to fill in that background with something because it cannot be transparent. It has to have something there. So if you are interested in being able to collage something, maybe it's even that you have a logo and you want to make sure that the background color on the website actually shows through, you're going to want to have a PNG file. PNG files are going to be larger, so you don't necessarily want to use them everywhere. If you just had photography, for example, you're not going to want to use a PNG file. But if there's something where you want to be able to layer it over something else, like a logo or something, that would be a really good case for having a PNG file. One example that I have is when I teach my video classes and I have students who want to bring in images or they want to bring in logos so that they can do motion graphics, my suggestion is work with PNG files so that way you can collage and layer things a lot easier. So PNG is really great for those sort of applications. your file size is going to be larger, but you can see that there is going to be this ability to have it be transparent. And that's what that checker box means. If you've ever seen any sort of image editing software, they'll usually put this checkbox in there so you can kind of see what's going on behind it. All right, so that was a little bit of a segue on the JPEG information and everything. I just wanted to give a little bit of context for that. Next that they have is GIFs, and they list them at kind of different sizes for some of these. So, and sorry, I say GIF. I know there's kind of a difference of opinion on how to pronounce it. But GIFs are lower quality than JPEG images, which means you can't show a whole lot of detail in them. They are used for more simplistic images, such as icons and decorative images. GIFs also support animation, which makes them unique. Regarding image optimization, GIFs are great for those plain, simple images on the web page that include just a few colors. So that would be something that would also be really good for a logo if you just have perhaps 2 to 3 colors. It's a very flat design. There's not any sort of gradation or anything in it. It's going to help where it's going to take up a lot less space, but then you have fewer options. And then of course there's the great thing about it being able to be animated. And I'm sure you've seen all sorts of different GIFs over your experience on the internet. Now, when I teach video classes, I like to talk about this interesting realm of working with GIFs, though. I think there's a lot of potential in creating digital media that uses GIFs rather than just images that are used for forums or avatars or potentially memes, and being able to use the advantage of the animation and how you could use that for an alternative to video, which could take a lot more space on a website. So this topic, cinemagraphs, it's a combination of cinema and photography, and it's something that I like to show where you can basically have a moving picture and something that you might not notice at first glance, but something that I think becomes a little bit more evident over time is GIFs only allow for a certain amount of range in the colors. So that's one of the biggest differences between PNG and JPEG files versus GIFs. GIFs don't allow for you to have a whole lot of color, and so what ends up happening is it has to simplify down the color palette range that it can really cover. And so what you'll notice with some of these is they start to look kind of grainy. And cinemagraphs are used a lot with content that is kind of similar to what you would have with, like here, there's a lot of fashion photography that is being used. I could see these being used in various banner ads that you might be able to load up a little bit more easy. But what you'll notice is there's going to be some simplification of the colors. Like there's some areas like here on the skin tone, it's a little bit more blocky. And these are actually kind of hard to set up. Some of them it's just a matter of having a looping video. Some of them you have to actually create a mask. So you have one part changing and then you have the rest is still. Like in this example here with this rabbit, it's having this be a looping video versus the rest of it is just a still taken from it. Or here, most of this is still versus her eyes and the sparklers are moving. Let me see if I can find, I think when white in particular, I think it makes it really easy to see just how little you can really see out of the color range. It starts looking really pixelated and blocky. But if you have a picture like this where not a whole lot is moving and you keep the image relatively small, you're not really going to notice so much the simplification of the color. And as you're saving something for the web, you can actually go in and you can kind of select what sort of color range you want to try to highlight and give the most colors to that particular picture. I think these ones that try to be a little bit more dynamic and have a lot more color range, like these ones are a little darker. I think these ones are a little bit harder to really show all the color. Like you can see it kind of simplifies a little bit on these steps. So if you're interested in this kind of idea, you might look up this term cinemagraphs, and you can find all sorts of different examples. This is from a website, cinemagraphs.com. And then I did already talk a little bit about PNG files, but we can take a look at what this website says. So PNG images are becoming more popular as an alternative to GIFs. PNGs support many more colors, and they don't degrade over time with resaves like JPEGs do. Even though the PNG file type is starting to be used more often, the file sizes can still be much larger. So you want to be kind of careful of when you use them, so that way it's not taking up too much space or taking too long to load on the page. Notice how the PNG 224 image is over 3 times larger in file size than the PNG 8. This is why you need to be very careful when you're saving your PNGs. Here's an extreme example where the image file size has been held constant at 24 kilobytes for all 3 file types. You can kind of see how much information is really in each image. As you can see, the JPEG is a clear winner here. GIFs and PNGs degrade in quality in order to remain at the same low file size. Here are some tips to remember when choosing file types. In most cases in e-commerce, JPEGs will be your best bet. They provide the best image quality for the smallest file size. Never use GIFs for large product images. The file size will be very large and there's no good way to reduce it because of limited colors. And then use GIFs for thumbnails and decorative images only. PNGs can be a good alternative to both JPEGs and GIFs. If you are only able to get product photos in PNG format, try using PNG 8 over PNG 24. PNGs excel as simple decorative images because of their extremely small file size. Most image editing software can save images to any of the file formats discussed. All right, and then it goes on to some of these other tips, and that's going to give you the basics of the different file types before I actually go into the image optimization tips. So here, I'm going to kind of summarize this, but large under-optimized images slow down site speed and drive people away from your store. So the advice here is try to keep your file sizes as small as possible by using image optimization. And so there's going to be some various things that get focused on here. So file size, compression level, image height and width. Here's some information here. Why do we optimize our images? Basically, it's talking about different data on how long people will stay on your website before they leave if your website takes longer to load because of the file sizes. Here we have page load time. If you want, you can read through this more on your own, but I'm going to just kind of go through. All right, so here we have our tips. Use concise and direct image names. And they give this really good example of this car. So they're saying, and you might have noticed this if you have a digital camera, but whenever you take a picture, your camera is going to assign some sort of name. Same thing like if you use a scanner or something, it's always going to assign some sort of name. And this isn't descriptive, and so you want to rename your files. And this talks about more file management as you would put it on your computer. And then you also want to think about your file management when you are putting things on the web. So in this case, they are suggesting to have text here that's descriptive. So that way, if somebody were searching in a search engine, especially doing like an image search, and they were to type in this information, it would be more likely to come up. So it's saying, you know, it doesn't necessarily matter the order that you write it in, but you might want to think about the terms that people are going to type in when they're looking for this sort of image. This is talking about your alternative text descriptions, and this isn't really something that we've talked about yet, but when you are creating an image, you're going to put in the name of the file, which they've said that they've created a file that's called 2012 Ford Mustang LX Red. And so they're using that same information as their alternative text. So if for some reason this image can't show up or someone can't see it and they're using an assistive technology, or if they're looking up an image in a search engine, this alternative text is going to come up and it's going to say this information. So you want whatever is in this alternative text description to be descriptive of what's in the image in a way that it is equally accessible to people who can't see it. So if let's say that you have your navigation is done with button images rather than text, then you want to make sure that you have text that is letting people know if they were to click on that image, it's going to take them to a particular spot. You want to let them know that it's going to be a button. And you want to think about what is actually being conveyed in that. For example, one thing that I think is kind of an interesting idea is if you were to take a meme and you were to try to describe what's in it to someone in a way that's equally accessible, it's not so much a matter of describing literally what's in the picture. You're also trying to convey, like, what is the actual joke of it? What is the information that's being conveyed by being sort of in the know? So you want to make sure that you give good descriptive directions so that way people understand what the point is of having that image shared. All right, the number one priority when it comes to image optimization is to fill out the alt attribute for each product image on your site. Here are some simple rules. Describe your images in plain language, just like you did for your image file names. If you sell products that have model numbers or serial numbers, use them in your alt attributes. Don't stuff your alt attributes full of keywords. The reason they're mentioning that is when people do search engine optimization, they often will focus a lot on their keywords, and it can actually be seen as a black hat tactic for you to have overuse of keywords because it can be seen as sort of spamming. And so you don't want to overuse things too much. You want to do the most appropriate keywords so that way it doesn't look like you're putting in a whole bunch of other stuff. So like here the example is car buy now cheap, best price on sale. That's seen as filler. Don't use alt attributes for decorative images. Search engines may penalize you for over optimization. So making sure that you use alt descriptions where it makes sense. Now, for your assignments, you're going to want to use alt descriptions for everything, just because if you don't, you're going to get errors saying that your website doesn't validate. And I want you to focus more on making sure things validate. But in the future, I would say that this is really going to depend on a sort of case-by-case basis on if you're using decorative images or not. All right, choose your image dimensions and product angles wisely. Now, this is more for the person who's just the photographer for the website or the person in charge of digital media. If you were trying to sell something, you'd want to make sure that you cover all possible images that somebody might want. And then you'll notice that the way that the files are named in a way to be descriptive of this, as well as the alt directions. So that's the biggest thing there, is considering that you have everything and then making sure that you put that in your descriptions. And then this next section is talking about your file sizes and how to make sure that everything fits. A bit of caution here, again, about how long things take to load. And one of the things that will get talked about in a later chapter is you can actually change which images get loaded in depending on how large your screen size is. So you could say, I want to bring in this very large image if it's on desktop. I want to bring in a smaller image if it's on tablet, and then a very small thumbnail if it's on mobile. So that way you don't have to load up a really large image and then shrink it down to fit. So that's going to help a lot too. But it's something that's going to get talked about in a later chapter. All right, so if you do end up taking some of our digital media classes, this is a process that I talk about in working with images, both in the video classes, and then I've got a digital media assets class that I teach, and we go over how to optimize images. If you're working just with the code side of things, you don't have to worry about this so much. But again, it's nice to know that this exists, so that way, if you are making requests of somebody who's creating images, you have a better idea of what you can request from someone. So this helps to give some examples of how much you can lower the file size of an image in Photoshop while being able to retain enough quality to that image that there's not a perceptible difference to the human eye. So in this case, they're giving a suggestion of you can basically lower the quality of the image to approximately 70%. And then it talks about, save your files as JPEG. What I like about this page, and this I think makes it well worth all of the other information. I would definitely recommend bookmarking this because this is something that you could be able to follow along with on your own, and you could use this to save images for the web in the future. So anyways, save as a JPEG. It talks about finding optimization settings, color, downsizing and sharpening, expected file size. What's really great about this is it'll tell you sort of a preview of how large the file will be depending on the settings that you picked. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. All right, so it might be a bit blurry, but here it shows the file format type, image size, and you can kind of see some other information. Let's see, that wasn't the picture I was wanting. This is the one. So we've got JPEG, it's optimizing it. You can see the quality here is set to 70. It has here the option of converting to RGB with the S in front of it. This is going to depend on how you're using the image or not, but then it gives you a monitor color preview. And then depending on how you are optimizing the image, you might be able to kind of choose what sort of colors you're using. And then here it's got quality, percentage information. And then on the bottom left is where you can see how large the picture is going to be. And then you can save it. Now, what I use this for a lot is I like to use this menu to be able to show people how to actually create GIFs. That's how you can create GIFs, is basically use kind of the same menu. And this is kind of showing similar things. We got width, height, scale, and here it's resampling. So it's trying not to lose too much quality. And then we've got that conversion as well. And then, now this changes all the time. I've been linking to this for a while, but it does list some alternatives. So there's PicMonkey, Pixlr. This is one that I used to use before really working a whole lot with Adobe software. Canva is really popular for different companies that are looking to create graphics that they don't necessarily have a designated person to create graphics. So this is a good software to get familiar with. And if I remember right, I think there's a free version, and then I think there's paid versions of it. Now, I definitely don't think this sort of thing replaces having a good quality person who's in charge of digital assets or social media, but it does go a long ways. There's different templates that you can use. One of the things that I think is important, even let's say that you are a graphic designer and rather than using Adobe software, you're working with Canva, just having that knowledge of how to take these templates and change them to fit your own content really goes a long ways, because they might be kind of good basic templates, but there could be certain things that look a little bit off. But I think for the most part, they work pretty well. So here, for example, there's different poster templates, and you can do quite a lot to customize it for yourself. But I haven't really used Canva so much, so I'm not sure how much they really block behind the pro version. But it is a nice way of just kind of getting started a little bit. And then, of course, there is GIMP, which is an open source free image editing software, which is a good alternative to working with Photoshop. I first tried using GIMP, I want to say by now it's probably been 15 years ago. One of the things that I found issue with it was it just wasn't a really great user experience, and even here it says it tends to be a bit clunkier. One of the issues I found with it was it took me forever how to figure out how to even just crop an image. But I do think in the amount of time that it's been out, it's improved its design more and more over time. And you'll notice that it should have a lot of the same sort of things. It's just going to look a little bit different, or maybe have a slightly different name. But once you learn the names for how to edit things, you'll notice that it's kind of a similar concept. All right, so we've already seen this part for the images. We can kind of, we can skip all that. Really, the majority of the information I was interested in was just the types of file types and everything. All right, so by now I should definitely have those images ready.